I'd like to acknowledge that we are here on the land of Gadigal people, on land that was never ceded. And I'm going to talk about Labor's trade policy. First, just reminding ourselves what the previous government, Liberal National Government's trade policy was. And it's very much in this tradition of neoliberal economic policy, so it's a sort of subset of a broader policy which is basically about having very small government, low taxes and redistributing income upwards, taxing working people more and taxing business less. But the trade aspect of it is aiming towards zero tariffs or taxes on imports, and all other what is perceived as barriers to trade and investment. And the idea that each country should specialise in its most competitive exports and import everything else at the lowest possible prices. And that you should have no active industry policies, no assistance to industry in addition to zero tariffs. And also minimum government regulation not only of trade but also of products and services. And what this does is maximise low-cost global production chains for corporations, but it intensifies competitive pressures on workers and communities and promotes a race to the bottom on labour rights and environmental standards. And we know the figures on global inequality have got worse, particularly over the last decade. That's not all down to unfair trade, but trade is supposed to lift people's living standards and contribute to greater equity. And we haven't seen clear evidence of that, although trade has expanded. So what we end up with is a lot of, especially in Australia, an over-dependence on imports with narrow manufacturing base and unable to produce, as we found during the pandemic, essential medical products, but also other products. And also because of the deregulation of services and so on, and the push to have foreign investment in services, scarce public health services to deal with the pandemic. So the other thing about this whole trade scene is that the whole process is very secretive and undemocratic, even in parliamentary terms. So trade agreements are negotiated in secret. We hear that they're going on, but we don't know what they're talking about. But they are legally binding on governments. And we don't see the text until after it's signed. Parliament doesn't see it and the public doesn't see it until after it's a done deal, which is a decision made by Cabinet, not Parliament. There is a Parliamentary Treaties Committee review, but the committee can't change the text, can't change what's been agreed. And there's no independent studies done of the economic or social or environmental or health or other impacts of these agreements. And Parliament only gets to vote on a very narrow range of implementing legislation, usually tariff rates, and that's it. They don't vote on the rest of the content of the trade agreement, although these trade agreements now have up to 30 chapters dealing with a wide range of issues. So they are designed to lock in future governments and reduce democratic space. Now, what happened during the pandemic is that the pandemic really dramatised the flaws of this arrangement and this sort of neoliberal ultra-free trade approach, because it showed us that we were too dependent on imports, and especially we had shortages of everything, but especially medical products and vaccines. It showed us that the temporary worker arrangements that are often made in trade agreements, where you have workers who are tied to one employer and can be deported if they lose their job, they weren't entitled to any support from government during the pandemic. It showed how there was potentially restricted regulation of essential services, and this came up around the debate about the Aged Care Royal Commission, when it emerged that it wasn't clear that aged care had been exempted from the rules of trade agreement, which say that you should essentially freeze regulation of services like aged care that are privately run but publicly funded. You should freeze that regulation and not increase it in future. Of course, that would stand in the way of implementing things like better staffing levels, better quality standards and so on. And despite the mantra of free trade, which is supposed to be about competition and lower prices, it was very clear during the pandemic, and it's still clear now, that trade rules that entrench monopolies on medicines for 20 years got in the way of access, equitable global access to medicines. That meant that the half a dozen companies that had a monopoly on medicines globally got to decide how much and what price medicines, vaccines and other COVID medicines were distributed. And of course we still have less than 20% of people in low-income countries being vaccinated. And that's a trade rule in the World Trade Organization and in our free trade agreements. And we've been campaigning to get a waiver on that related to the pandemic, but I won't go into that now. And of course, we've also had the additional legal rights for corporations to sue governments over changes in regulation, called Investor State Dispute Settlement, or ISDS. This is the rule that allowed the Philip Morris Tobacco Company to sue the Australian government over our plain packaging law. And during the pandemic, there have been threats from corporations where there are trade agreements with this provision that they will use this to sue the government for claimed compensation over what they see as restrictions on their activities during the pandemic. But this neoliberal trade policy has been contested by community groups and also increasingly by the academic evidence. So all of the organisations that are in our network, unions, public health, environment, churches, etc., have contested the secretive process, the dominance of global corporate interests and the impacts on workers. So we had debates about the US FTA, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the China FTA. And there is growing academic evidence of broader neoliberal economic policy impact on global and local inequalities. So studies by Stiglitz, Piketty and others. And of course the pandemic exposed the flaws that I've already talked about. So the actual debate has really got a lot stronger about these, and that debate and unions and others have influenced Labor policy. So we do have a much better platform on trade policies from the Labor Party, and what we're trying to do now is get them to implement those policies in government. So the first one is a more transparent process. They've said they will have things like public statements to Parliament of objectives before negotiations start, release of text during negotiations, release of the final text before signing, and independent assessment of economic and social costs and benefits. And they've also said that Parliament should debate the whole agreement, not just the enabling or implementing legislation. They've also said in their policy that there will be some red lines, that some things will be excluded from trade agreements. Restrictions on local industry policy support, and they've said that they'll be more willing to use government purchasing of local goods and services to encourage local industries like renewable energy and other local industries. They've said they won't increase medicine monopolies through trade agreements, and they have actually supported a waiver on the current WTO rules and other trade rules about medicine monopolies for the duration of the pandemic. They've said that they won't support corporate rights to sue governments, ISDS. The example that I gave before, Philip Morris Tobacco Company suing the Australian government. They won't support having those sorts of provisions in trade deals. And they've also said they won't support increases in temporary workers who are vulnerable to being deported if they lose their jobs. Also, they won't support removal of labour market testing to demonstrate genuine temporary labour shortages. So if there is a genuine temporary labour shortage, that will have to be demonstrated by labour market testing, not removing labour market testing as a lot of trade agreements do. And they've also, I think, certainly from our point of view, in a very hopeful sense, said that they will include in trade agreements legally enforceable labour rights based on ILO conventions and legally enforceable environmental standards. And there is even a clause in the policy that says they'll ban the products of forced labour. So that would go some way to redressing the downward pressure on labour rights and environmental standards by making sure that there's a floor under which, in trade rules, that mitigates against those downward pressures. But there are some catches in this process, and one of them is that the policy did say that in opposition, Labor was not obliged to block trade deals that had these red lines in them, but once it gets into government, it will actually implement those red lines and other policies. So that meant that Labor in opposition did vote for a number of trade agreements which had some of these red lines, like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which changed its name to the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, and free trade agreements with China, Indonesia and Hong Kong, which all have both the corporate rights to sue governments, or ISDS, and increased numbers of vulnerable temporary workers. So one of the questions we're putting to the government is, because just before the election, the government signed a deal with the UK and an interim deal with India, what we're asking them is, will they support those deals even if they include some red lines, and will they be willing to renegotiate those red lines? And the India agreement is an interim agreement. There's a schedule to negotiate a more comprehensive agreement with India, and again we're saying that they should implement their new consultative process for that agreement and for the EU trade agreement, which is also still under negotiation, and any future agreements. In other words, they should implement the policy for a more transparent and inclusive policy. It's interesting that with the EU, for example, they're good on saying that they want to have environment and labour rights. But because they have a very big pharmaceutical industry, they've actually asked for some longer medicine monopolies. So we'll be certainly saying to the government they shouldn't agree to that, because that's one of the red lines as well. There's also, the previous government had proposed a negotiation with the Gulf countries in the Middle East, which include Saudi Arabia and Qatar and a number of other countries which haven't even signed agreements on human rights and labour rights, through the UN or the ILO, and they have very notorious violations of human rights and labour rights. Saudi Arabia, for instance, recently executed 80 people. a mass execution. And of course they have a bonded labour system as well. So what are the chances that Labor will do this? Well, there'll certainly be pressure on them from the labour movement and from other civil society groups to implement the policy. But some of the pressures that we'll face is the context that they're operating in, that there's a growing strategic competition between the US and China. And this occurred after we negotiated, or the government negotiated, the Liberal National Government negotiated a free trade agreement with China. And it's worth saying that at the time, unions and civil society groups said to the government, China has a very bad labour and human rights record, and we should be not negotiating a free trade agreement, which is essentially a preferential agreement with that country until they do something about that record. At the time, the government completely ignored us, but now, because of increased strategic tensions, they're very much more prepared to admit that that's the case. So trade deals are always influenced by geopolitics. So one of the issues is that, you know, the trade deals negotiated over here, it's meant to be about economic gains and lifting living standards, but it's always influenced by who our friends are and where the strategic competition is. So that current trade deals with the United Kingdom and India are part of a strategic alliance, so they've got to be seen in the context of AUKUS, which is the US, UK, Australia defence arrangement, and also the Quad, which is the US, Japan, India and Australia. So both of those agreements were kind of hurried up last year because of those defence and strategic agreements. So there'll be pressure to agree to those agreements for defence and strategic reasons. The danger is that things that red lines will be ignored because of that pressure. The other pressure we face is corporate lobbying and advice from, especially corporate lobbying, that want to have provisions in trade agreements that suit them, not necessarily that will lift living standards and be good for everyone. And also especially the senior levels of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, which operate very much in a neoliberal type framework. So basically what we have to do to support trade justice is campaign, I think, for Labor to implement its progressive trade policies. And this means demanding more transparent and accountable trade agreement process, supporting local industry development policies and local procurement policies, making sure they're not fettered by trade agreements, supporting fully enforceable labour rights and environmental standards, including carbon emission targets, and opposing things like increased medicine monopolies or increased special rights for corporations to sue governments. And also opposing things like the removal of labour market testing and increased vulnerable temporary workers or restrictions on government procurement. So we're back to education, organise, mobilise. But I think we're doing that within a much better framework than with the previous government. We have got a government that says this is their policy. We've got to just make sure that they actually implement the policy. And there's some information there about our network. We're a network of 60 community organisations. As Peter said, we had our 20th anniversary during the pandemic. We have current campaigns on equitable access to COVID vaccines and treatments, more transparent process, and on those current agreements with India and the UK and the EU. And there's some, you can go to our website to donate or join or support us. We've got a Facebook page.
So I'll kick off by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we all meet today and pay my respects to elders, leaders past and present. I also want to thank Peter for the invitation to come along and speak today. He's always thinking of me when he puts on these events, and I try to make time to get here when I can. And to be honest, I missed a few up because I put them in my diary in the wrong day, so I owe Peter a few back. And I said to him, anytime you need me, I will be here. Secondly, thank you to Pat. It's always a pleasure to share a stage with Pat, and I've been working alongside her for a number of years now, just making sure that trade stays on the agenda across the labour movement, but importantly, in that conversation inside Labour, and that it's taken seriously. For those who haven't met me, I'm Steve Murphy. I'm the National Secretary of Australian Manufacturing Workers Union. I've been a member now since I was a second-year apprentice, 26 years as a member, and I've been working for the union for 19 years. I was State Secretary in 2017 and National Secretary in 2019, late 2019, so almost 2 years, almost 2 years in the job, of course. So, like many people in this room, I'm relieved at the results of the federal election. We've watched for years with dismay the lack of culture and ambition of the previous government in terms of most of progressive politics and the agenda that we needed to happen. And it's great to bear witness now to a country that is undergoing significant change, but change that is being led with a level of compassion. And we're already seeing some of that at an international level, where we've seen a lot of those relationships with Albo overseas and others overseas kind of repairing and resetting, not just those relationships, but our standing as a country at a global level. And you know, while foreign affairs might not be one of those exciting issues for the general public, we've watched the previous government with a level of collective embarrassment, I guess you'd say, where they've trashed our reputation internationally and trashed the Australian brand. And the last 9 years has been a pretty appalling one in terms of our approach to trade as well. We've spent, of course, 30 years striding the neoliberal agenda, simply opening up our borders, not protecting workers or our industry or even our national identity or our self-sufficiency. And we've got a government from both sides in succession that have been acting simply as the profit enhancers for private capital, changing the rules so that they can move their investments and their profits to avoid their obligations and to avoid scrutiny. Now, if you've ever spoken to me in the past about free trade agreements, I usually talk for a long time, but it will mostly be focused about the decimation of regional jobs all across Australia, where we're filled into believing that if we sign up to this free trade agenda, that we'd all be driving around in Mercedes-Benz and that we'd all be kind of lifted up the ladder with the promises that we made. But the truth is, we traded away tens of thousands of good, reliable, well-paid union jobs that regional Australia could rely on, that kids could rely on, a job coming through, so that we could buy a fridge for $70 cheaper. And you have to say, if you're looking back over that time, you'd say that is not a fair trade. Now, during those global trade negotiations, we have largely been a junior partner, and we have always been out-negotiated. The reason that these things are always negotiated in secret is so that we never see the details and we never get to see the level of incompetence that happens at that level when these negotiations are taking place. But what we do know from the outcomes of these free trade agreements time and time again, there's always workers who pay the price for Australia being out-negotiated or outmanoeuvred in relation to the results. Now, just because you criticise the way that trade agreements happen or the way that trade is done in a way that benefits corporation only does not mean that you criticise trade altogether. We've had no mature debate in this country about our trade agenda and where it should sit. Whenever you start the discussion about what trade should be used for and its purpose, it's always shut down by sycophants from both sides of politics, and you're labelled as being against the national interest if you want to reframe or talk about trade in a way that benefits working class people at the centre. Now, our campaign that was led by the AMW, but certainly supported across the broader trade union movement, was about improving Labor's platform, but mostly about changing the mindset inside Labor and those decision makers in over 2 conferences, and it took us 2 goes to get it to where we needed. And both of those conferences were a turning point for the opportunity for significant change in relation to trade. The first one was a change that was based on us picking a fight with Labor at the right time in order to get them to take trade and the trade agenda seriously. And the second one was to reshape the trade agenda with a whole host of policy and platform changes behind it that would allow us to be able to negotiate in a different way, and I'll go through those in a moment. But I think what we all agree is that we should have a trade agenda that is smart, that is compassionate, that is ambitious, but mostly that is fair. And it's about Australia not just being a quarry and a farm and a nice place to visit. So we've got all the tools and the resources for us to be a manufacturing and an energy superpower. It's something that we have been advocating for a long period of time, and our vision has got to be that we produce more than what we consume. That's where we participate in trade, to be able to identify those areas where we produce more than what we're consuming and be able to trade with the world on those. So we've got a whole host of commitments, and we were able to change the platform, as I said, but now it's about legislation and enforcement. That is the job that Labor has in front of it to do, and those people who have kind of benefited from the campaign that we ran during the election, that have now got a seat of power and privilege and position, and now got a responsibility to us to make sure that they go forward and legislate and enforce that platform agenda. And I want to talk about it in two key areas. The first one is linking our trade agenda to some key platform and policy issues and the portfolios that sit underneath those. And secondly, about less concentration on ministerial power. So obviously an indicator of trade justice is that we're able to interlink with other areas where Labor has a big ambition. And their policy, I'll just read out the policy wording, but what it says is that Labor will develop industry policy and provide structural assistance to sectors of the economy, workers and regions which are impacted by economic change. Now, we shouldn't read the platform as being separate sentences that are in isolation. The platform should be read as a document that is about lifting each part of the platform up. Now, we've got a positive manufacturing and agenda policy that Labor has announced all during the election campaign. It's in the platform, but they made manufacturing and energy central to all of their policy announcements when they were fronting the TV cameras and talking to working class voters. And that offers us a strategic and significant economic strength. If we are able, but when we are able to get collaboration between not just trade and primary industries, but if we're able to get collaboration between trade and industry and energy and primary industry and the resources ministries and portfolios, we have a path, and a significant path, to unlocking trade justice and transformation of Australia's manufacturing and trade agenda. Now, large corporations who own these farms and these quarries have a very short-sighted and narrow-sighted view about how trade is operated. That is to cash in as early as possible and make their profit as early as what they possibly can during the manufacturing cycle. And we need some serious dialogue about how we add value at each step in that change. In that chain. One is to secure cheap power. Secondly is to have a vibrant, high-skilled manufacturing industry. And thirdly is to rebuild our self-reliance and our self-sufficiency as a nation. Now, that collaborative approach between ministers and assistant ministers and departments is going to be one of the first litmus tests that we have to take during this first 3 years of the Labor government. And that is a test to see whether or not that trade justice is actually centre of Labor's agenda for this first term. Now, the ALP are saying that they are reformers, that they've got a reform agenda, that they're going to make significant change, and they're committed to the platform. But we've got to keep doing work outside the Parliament to lead that ambition and make sure that Labor does not lose its courage doing this. The second one I was going to talk about was the other measure being democratisation. Now, they have committed in the platform to having a Labor advisory committee on trade, and secondly, legislating that there's going to be transparency. And there's a couple of measures that you do in terms of transparency on the way through, but transparency after the agreement is made. And that means that we've got less concentration of ministerial power. We will have a set minimum level of standards that need to be adhered to when we do these trade agreements. And thirdly, that there's going to be an independent assessment on how well we went during the negotiations and what the economic benefit is to Australia. And all those things have got to be done before the agreement is signed. And you can see from that that the labour movement, civil society and that small business have got an opportunity to jump in, to scrutinise, but mostly to participate in what our trade agenda is going to be at a national level and to reshape that in a way where we all benefit. It reshapes how negotiations happen, and it will make it harder to undo the changes that we're able to make, which are positive. One of the other things it will also do is that it will make it harder for other governments, meaning governments of other countries, to be able to sit by and just wait for there to be an electoral cycle and hopefully a change of government back the other way, and they'll be forced to build relationships that are based upon fairness and based upon trust. Now, our opportunity for influence at a world stage, meaning Australia's opportunity for influence, is only as big as what we allow ourselves to make it. And that means that we need to have a minister and assistant minister that have a big agenda, a big vision, and have got a department, and a number of departments, that are prepared to back that in and make it live. And I am told that Labor is going to make this a priority, that they are going to craft the words of this with the intention that it's going to make it hard for future governments to undo this democratisation of the trade agenda in negotiations. Now, both of those changes by themselves might seem as though they are insignificant and not something that is going to be a great big splash. But we have to get those ingredients right in order to reshape trade and make those first few steps to show that Australia is going to be a leader when it comes to it. But the truth is that fair trade is in need of a desperate makeover. To many, trade is an issue that is far too complex and it's too hard to unravel. And we need to reframe trade to be a lever to progress our nation's ambitions, but secondly, that it is a lever to deliver justice to working class people all around the world. Now, our labour movement has also got to have some serious conversations internally, but a conversation with people all across the country. And that is, we've got to bring people with us and reframe this in a way that empowers people to participate and empowers them to make an impact when it comes to this trade agenda that we've got to roll out. And we've waited 9 long years for this moment that changed the government and to have a bigger conversation about what our trade agenda is going to be. And there's a hunger that sits behind Labor's victory, but a hunger that sits behind the promises that have been made. It is going to be our discipline that will hold Labor to those promises, and secondly, hold Labor to not trade off when business and those opponents throw everything they had to keep things the same, to continue on their cycle of defending their profits at any cost. But we can all pull this together in a way that has got integrity, that has got purpose and has compassion, and ensure that future generations look to now as a time to learn about the way that you engage at that level to deliver change that is lasting and then will deliver change for working class people around the world. So that's what I wanted to cover, Pat and Peter. That covers what you asked. Yeah.